as we observe Human Rights Day today, it's a public holiday today after the day yesterday. Around the world, it's also World Water Day. We're also a country that's very water stressed. And while we've had good rains on the Highveld this year, Cape Town came very close to day zero in the last few years. Maureen has had huge problems. One of the problems we're now seeing is climate change. Maureen Nkandu is the Regional Communications Manager for WaterAid, Southern Africa. Maureen, good afternoon to you. What kind of impact does climate change have on water supplies in our part of the world?
Hi, good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you for hosting me. Definitely a number of consequences. I just heard you there saying in your headlines about how the evacuations due to floods in Australia. This is a critical issue. So climatic factors such as flooding, drought, and so on have actually impacted access to water adversely. So obviously when there are droughts, people do not have enough water for their livelihoods, for them to survive, for their crops to grow, especially those who actually depend on agriculture for growth. And then there's the flooding aspect. You know, recently here in Southern Africa, a number of countries experienced Cyclone Eloise, which had a devastating effect on infrastructure. Roads were cut off, houses were destroyed. And people were not able to actually carry on with their lives as normal. So there are a number of factors. These are just a few examples. Essentially, what we're saying is that because of an increase in harsh climatic conditions, weather patterns these days, obviously this is affecting the way people live their lives. It's affecting, you know, what sort of access people have to important essential services such as water supply. Look at rural areas where people have to travel long distances for them to be able to access water for their livelihood. I can give you an example here in South Africa. At least 1.7% of the population in rural areas still collect their water from streams and rivers. So if these rivers dry up, where do they get their water from? If roads are cut off and infrastructure is cut off, where do they get it from? So it's a critical time, and what is of concern to us as WaterAid is that we're saying 5% of total global climate funding is spent on helping countries adapt to their climatic changing conditions. And that money is not actually targeted at communities that are most vulnerable to harsh climatic conditions. So there really ought to be a change in our thinking and in our prioritization around where that funding should be going.
I suppose what happens is that if a water source dries up, if people, as you say, I mean, some of them still have to go to a river and go and get water. It's often the women who are sort of forced to do that. Then if the water dries up, people have to move. They have no choice. They can't live without water. That means they move to towns and cities who are already battling with their own water supplies. And so the problem just gets worse and worse. In other words, you end up in a situation where people are forced to move, and they add to the stress of supplying water in cities.
That's right. So the pressure on already dwindling supplies is actually a challenge. You know, WaterAid works in 5 other countries in the region. South Africa, we have 2 key projects in Gauteng and Limpopo, but we also have other countries like Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, Madagascar, and so on. So you see, you have what we call shanty townships, where people migrate a lot from rural areas to urban centers, primarily because they don't have access to some of these provisions like water, essentially. So they're looking for a better life. And then there's congestion already in informal settlements, in shanty townships, where there isn't proper infrastructure, where there isn't easy access to water supply and other basic services, and then putting a lot of pressure on those particular environments in which they settle in. In addition to that is also cross-border migration, which then brings a challenge around, you know, provision of supplies and essential services, scrambling for whatever provisions are in the different countries where communities migrate to, and the tension that comes thereof. So clearly there is a big issue around lack of access and how climatic conditions are affecting, you know, the development of communities. Women are most affected, as you say, because they are the ones who have to do most of the domestic chores. You have situations where girls cannot go to school because they're kept back to help with domestic chores, but because they also have challenges. What about issues of sexual and health reproductive rights? What happens to girls, for instance, who are menstruating, where they don't have proper access to water for them to keep themselves safe? I can also give you another adverse effect. Recently, in one of the countries in the region, Zambia, somebody was killed because the toilet, it was actually a latrine in which they were taking a bath. I think they doubled it up as a bathroom as well. Collapsed due to heavy rain. It fell on them and they died. Now, that was a case that was reported. We have similar situations in a number of countries in the region and African countries and also globally. So critically, there are issues around how much is being committed, how much of our budgets are going to ensuring that there is sustainable and sufficient access to what we call water, hygiene and sanitation, WASH in our communities, or the other way around, water, sanitation and hygiene, so that our communities would be able to live the sustainable good life that we aspire for 2030. Now, one of the things that WaterAid is saying as we prepare for COP26, which is the global climate conference that will be converging in Glasgow later this year, is that we are urging high-income nations to significantly increase their climate finance for adaptation. So this includes fulfilling their previous commitments to give half of the total climate adaptation finance to vulnerable communities. Many of these are in Africa, in Southern Africa, so that these communities would be able to cope with the harsh reality of living with climate change and, of course, the effects that are brought on by these climatic factors.
Maureen, I mean, one of the issues as well, I mean, let me just give you a stark example. This is not from a science fiction movie, although we've probably all seen the movie, but I'm talking about what happens in the Western Cape. So we know that there are more people living in the Western Cape than have done in the past. We also know that it seems something has happened with the weather there. It doesn't seem to get quite the rain that it used to in the winter months. Now, it's one thing for people to move from an area because the river dries up, because of all climate change, or the lake dries up, or whatever it is, and they move to the city. Here you're talking about a massive city, one of the biggest cities in this country, that may not actually be able to supply enough water to the people who live there. I mean, go fast forward 10 years, if we don't sort out the Lesotho Highlands water project, the second phase of that, you're going to have a similar problem in Gauteng. And one of the big factors in this, it's not just people moving around, it is climate change as well. That's a stark reality.
Stark, and let's not even start, before we even start saying what's likely to happen in 10 years' time, let's look at now. We're in a situation of a pandemic, COVID-19. What is the most important thing that we're saying to our communities? Wash your hands for at least 20 seconds with clean running water and soap. Now look at the statistics. How many people have got access to that clean running water in their communities? Maybe the situation in South Africa is slightly better in that 89% of households have actually access to some of kind of water supply compared to other countries in the region. But then it is a critical, essential service. Now, if we're telling communities that that is the first line of defense against COVID-19 and other diseases, and then you find that here in South Africa, for instance, only 23% of people have, at least 23% of the population have difficulty washing their hands because they don't actually have easy access to water, then we have a big problem. Yes, now, if it is a critical problem now, what are the projections in future? Which is why, for WaterAid, we feel that it's essential that there ought to be a priority in our national budgets around ensuring that access to water, sanitation and hygiene is critical in healthcare facilities, in schools, and in domestic homes for domestic use for people. How is this done? There's also got to be a partnership. It cannot only be a responsibility of governments alone. Yes, governments need to ensure that they revisit their budgets, and this is our important advocacy call. But what about the private sector? There's got to be a very strong private-public partnership around ensuring that there's this access. Recently, and just after the pandemic was declared by WHO, one of the things that WaterAid did was to have a discussion with municipalities to ensure that water supplies were not disconnected to residences so that people could have this essential service. Another thing is civic empowerment. People should demand the right. How much information do our communities have around them knowing that access to these facilities, especially water, is a human right? So civil society also comes in there. And we're working with civil society to give the research, the data, the statistics, so that that voice is actually strong enough for community to understand that this is an essential service now, today. And in terms of planning, yes, we are asking that there should be designated and dedicated ministries in our governments that are looking specifically specifically at water, sanitation, and hygiene. I mean, imagine you and I without water just for a day and how much we'd freak out and feel the world's coming to an end. Whereas, you know, there are communities that are having to live like that in a case where there are pandemics and other diseases. And yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer. It's got to be a priority.
At the same time, Maureen, I mean, the unfortunate consequence of all of this can be more conflict over water. I mean, just on our continent at the moment, a little bit north from where we are, we have the huge fight over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Ethiopia wants to build this dam. Egypt is very upset. Sudan is very upset. We're going to see more conflict like that if we don't plan for the future now.
Well, we've heard a lot of people say the next world wars will be fought not over you know, political superiority or armaments and so on, or nuclear proliferation, but over water. It is true. Populations are growing, which means that there's a scramble for very few resources. Of course, we cannot comment about the dam conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt and other surrounding countries. But for WaterAid, we just feel that it's very important for communities, for governments, for civil society, for development entities and others to look at some of the statistics that we provide, to look at what the information is that we're giving around, you know, access to these important services, and see how we can tackle and provide sustainable solutions to. It's not just about access, but it's also about sustainable development. How does the lack of access to wash affect gross domestic, you know, general development in a community? How does it affect education? How does it affect basic health care in communities if hospitals and clinics do not have water? So there are a lot of socio-economic development aspects that are tied around access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And I think that we need to start putting this aspect on the spotlight. We're happy that we've got a strong partnership with media like yourselves, who repeatedly talk about this. We do not need World Water Day for us to start thinking about how important it is for us to look at data that comes from UNICEF, from WHO, from WaterAid, around how climatic factors, how the lack of access to water, sanitation, and hygiene, and other political commitments is actually affecting our communities and our development projections.
Maureen Nkandu, thanks very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time, from WaterAid, Southern African Regional Communications Director. It's an important conversation. In a moment.